All right, folks, today we're going to talk about Jung's concept of the anima and the animus. I love this concept because it shows us that our psyche is much more complex than we think, particularly when it comes to gender and biological sex. I think that, especially in older generations, they tend to think that uh, they only show masculine characteristics or feminine characteristics according to their gender. And Jung's concept of this makes it much more nuanced than that. And actually, after we look at Jung's perspective, I want to talk about my perspective on it and bring in a lot of the other stuff I've learned about the shadow and get a much more nuanced definition even than Jung's one. So I'm looking forward to that.
This is Deep Psychology. I'm Ross. We blend spirituality, psychology, and self-help to shine a light on your inner workings. Listen if you want to get real, powerful insights and avoid all the fluffy nonsense that abounds in self-help circles. You'll know more about how your psychology works than 99% of people on the planet. Find me on all the major podcasting platforms or head to deep-psychology.com, visited by thousands every month, for tons of free resources. And I'm now on Patreon. I'd really appreciate you supporting the show, and in return you can access exclusive perks. Alright, time for the show.
By doing this, you're going to get a much more detailed understanding of your own psyche and how it works. And we're going to finish by talking about how this nuanced definition can help you in your shadow work, which is something I've been talking about a lot recently, particularly in the Dreams series. So let's get started by talking about Jung's definition. So Jung saw the anima as man's unconscious image of a woman, and the animus as the woman's unconscious image of a man. Basically, regardless of whatever gender or sex we are, we hold an idealized, generalized image of what the other sex is and what it ought to be. Especially, that's Jung's definition of it. Jung said, quote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of a woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. The same is true of the woman. She too has her inborn image of man." End quote. So I said image of a woman. It's a subtle unconscious thing, but it drives your behavior because you're basically relating to that idea all the time, in your relationships, when you're talking about the other sex, when you're looking for a partner and so on, even perhaps in your sex life and so on. You're relating to this unconscious image that you have of the other sex. So these are part of the personal shadow, but they exist in the collective unconscious as well. At least Jung believed that they did, because we sort of inherit them through the collective, not just through our personal experiences and so on, but the collective shapes our unconscious as well, and we hold these sort of generalized, idealized images of the other sex through the collective unconscious as well. And what happens as well is that our personal experiences influence and mold and create our particular anima or animus or both. And we're going to talk about whether you have one or both or in just a minute. I also add that the shadow isn't just like a mental image that we have. It acts on all sort of levels of the individual. It acts on our personality, our behavior, the emotions we experience, and so on. Shadows aren't just images. They're really like powerful subconscious forces that define us in many ways as much as our conscious personality traits do. And we're going to explain why that is in just a minute. Like all the psychological concepts that humans have come up with, this concept of the anima and the animus was, influenced by the times when Jung created it or spotted it, tried to describe it. And so it to our modern sensibility can seem a bit restrictive in terms of biological sex and gender and so on. In my next episode, I'm actually going to treat that in much more detail. Today, I'm going to give you a way of looking at the anima and the animus that goes beyond all the arguments, about biology and about gender and so on. But what I will say is that I think Jung, in making this definition, he probably didn't realize, or he maybe, I don't know if he didn't realize, if he didn't want to realize, or whatever it was, is that mm, being a man doesn't mean you're 100% masculine. Um, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to have any repressed masculine traits. Actually, it's quite naive to think that you are, because let's face it, imagine you were a biological man and you were 100% masculine. That would assume that you have no shadow, because you'd be 100% embodying the typical sort of set of masculine traits, and that is not true because we all have shadow. So it doesn't make sense, and it's also quite naive to think that a woman is 100% feminine, because she has repressed feminine traits, and each of the two uh, biological sexes also incorporate the other pole as well. And that's part of how I'm going to look at this, is to see that actually biological sex, it might constrain us biologically, but psychologically it the picture is much more complicated, and we can't just divide things up so nice and easily. So let me go into my more nuanced, perhaps modern definition of the anima and the animus. And this all comes from my own sort of implementation and study of shadow theory and human development and so on. Particularly people like Ken Wilber, Doshin Roshi, and others who have some sort of a postmodern perspective. They're not so interested in arguing about all the fine details of gender and sex and so on. They're more interested in integrating lots of different perspectives. That's sort of my where I like to approach this from. So one thing you have to keep in mind as I'm going to talk about this more nuanced definition is that a conscious trait, a trait that we consciously embody, whether it's masculinity, a masculine trait or a feminine trait, or masculinity as a whole or femininity as a whole, that implies the unconscious trait. It actually implies the presence of the unconscious trait. And let me explain why. It's kind of like when you buy a mask to put on over your face, maybe it's Halloween and you're dressing up. You buy a mask, and when you look at the front of the mask, you see the contours facing out the way. Okay, mostly out of the way. And you might think, oh well, that's all there is to the mask. It's all pointing out the way. But actually, if you turn the mask around, you see the reverse. You see all the contours that point in the opposite direction. They're now pointing towards you, and you're now seeing that the the features of the mask couldn't exist without the negative. And it's only when you turn the mask around that you really appreciate that. You really appreciate that the negative is actually essential for the mask to exist. Now, basically, what this means is, what I'm trying to get at is that all of our personality traits, regardless of whether we consider them feminine or masculine or not, every single one implies it's the presence of the opposite. It's it's like, in order for something to be a certain color, it has to be not be the other color. Now, when it comes to objects, it's maybe not a big deal. When it comes to us, to be one way, we have to, by definition, not be another way. And so that absence is sort of present in our psyche as the absence. Now, that is really important when we're talking about masculinity and femininity, and we're going to get to that in a minute. So, by extension, all of our masculine traits, let's forget about biological sex and gender identification right now. Just forget about that. Just think about masculine traits and feminine traits beyond a person, beyond a personality necessarily. All of our masculine traits, by definition, contain in shadow the feminine sort of the opposite of them, which a lot of times can be come across as quite a feminine thing. And the same thing goes with feminine traits. Just by their presence, they contain um, the opposite, which is often it's the masculine side. So if we identify with all our masculine traits, we are basically not we. The more we identify and cling on to them, the less we are acknowledging that those feminine traits are in us. Perhaps they're down, they're down in the subconscious, and they're not conscious traits, but they're within us. And the more we cling to our masculinity, the more we're denying the femininity within us, and the same goes for the other pole. Now, listen, I'm not saying that this doesn't mean we can't be more masculine or feminine without repressing the other pole. I'm not saying that that we should just be 50-50 or none of it at all. It just means that we contain a certain blend of the two, and although we might, even if we've got no shadow, no repressed material, we might naturally have a balance, like a 60-40, 70-30 kind of thing. The more we cling to a certain gender or stereotype about our behavior and how we should be based on our biological sex, basically, the more inauthentic and unbalanced we are. So we might authentically be 70-30, but we're so clinging on to the 70 masculine, feminine, let's say, the 70% masculine, we cling on to it so much that actually the feminine withers and dies. And it's not that it's not there, but it's just not, we're not really living it. And so we're clinging on to this masculinity, and we're actually becoming very inauthentic, because that authentic femininity within us is just withering on the vine. And that's not to mention just again, the presence of the 70% masculine. This is just an example. It means that all of that has like its mirror or its contrast, which is it's really an absence of all those traits. Those are still contained within us. And so just even if we are fully clean and there's no repressing of our say the 30% feminine, it doesn't it we still have to acknowledge that just by virtue of having a predominantly masculine personality, we're actually still sort of the absence is itself a kind of shadow. So now that I've said that, let me tentatively extend Jung's definition by saying that the anima and the animus are the eternal concept that we hold regarding both sexes, regardless of our biological sex, regardless of our gender identification. And just in this way, by taking gender and sex out of the equation, we I'm basically saying it doesn't matter what your sex is, it doesn't matter what your gender is. Not that it's unimportant, but it's unimportant for this particular conversation. We all have masculine and feminine traits, and as such, we all have unconscious eternal concepts of both sexes. We all have an anima and an animus, and it's kind of like the more masculine you have, the bigger your anima is, and the more feminine you have, the bigger your animus is, because it's the contrasting effect. It's like the absence creates a kind of hole or a kind of shadow in the psyche. Now, the extent to which we can consciously embody our own anima and animus is the extent to which they are conscious aspects of our personality. They're not underground operating on us without us knowing it, which tends to be how our anima and animus run our lives. And it's the extent to which we can fully embody the full gamut of human traits, whether they're masculine or feminine or otherwise, in our own unique way. So, as I said, I would still say that if you're biologically male, you're probably principally going to have masculine traits, but it's maybe 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. And the more you repress and deny the femininity within you, the bigger your anima is going to be. So, and the more tyranny it's going to have over you because it's part of you, but you're just not acknowledging it. And I could say the exact same about femininity as well. You know, women aren't just feminine. They're maybe 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. But, you know, again, the more you repress that masculinity, the more it's still going to be there, but it's going to be withered and sort of not, it's going to be sort of running your life rather than you running it. So I'm going to be talking in a bit more detail about the gender and sex thing when it comes to Anima and Animus, but I hope this gives you a good idea of how I see it, the subject. And though I love, I love talking about this stuff from a sort of theoretical point of view. The main point of everything that I do is to help you see it for yourself and to help you transform yourself based on the knowledge that I give you. So if you're into shadow work, I'm actually writing an article on shadow work right now, and you can learn more about shadow work in my other materials. But as you embark on your own shadow work, I encourage you, whatever biological sex you are, whatever gender you identify yourself to be, I don't care if, I don't care what it is. Try to unearth your unconscious masculine and feminine traits because it doesn't matter how much you identify with one or the other. Both of them are probably still going to be in shadow to some extent. You know, our psyche is very complicated. We have a lot that we don't consciously acknowledge, and it's not an issue. I'm not judging you. You know, I'm the exact same, but by having this more nuanced look at the anima and animus, we can realize that we've all got these traits within us, and it's a matter of how fully do we embody them. And doing shadow work is the best way to re-embody your shadows. I also say that it takes a lot of bravery to admit that these repressed traits are within you, especially when we're talking about things that, it's to do with masculinity and femininity, because these things have a lot of baggage around them. But know that doing so is a huge step towards psychological maturity and the blossoming of your full, authentic personality. So that's the reward you get. You get the reward of realizing that actually you have both and that you're much more authentic and fulfilled when you can consciously realize that and bring them into your character in a conscious way. All right, I hope you come back for my next episode on a nuanced look at gender when it comes to animus, the anima and the animus. For now, do subscribe to the channel. You're welcome to check out all my free resources on the channel and also on my website, deep-psychology.com. Thanks for sticking around. Take care, and I'll see you soon.